Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Chris Hattingh. Chris, how are you doing?
Hi, Nick. Doing well, thanks. Ready for another CRA takeover today.
Indeed. You guys are hijacking us regularly at the moment. We also have Mr. Gerbrandt van Heerden. Harry, how are you doing?
Hi, Nick. I'm doing well, thank you. Good to be back.
It's good to have you back. Now, unfortunately, today we have to start with some very bad news. And this is from the desk of the President, Cyril Ramaphosa. And I'm just going to be quoting a bit from a Institute of Race Relations press release that was put out on this. And the title, I think, kind of sums it up, which is, "What was Ramaphosa thinking?" Yesterday, President Cyril Ramaphosa signed into law the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, the EEB bill, which promises to implement a far more aggressive, authoritarian, and sort of, I would say, racist form of affirmative action, which is exactly the wrong thing for the country's economy and prosperity at the moment. The bill's been kicking around since 2020, when the Employment Minister, Nicholas Lorimer, called for a more aggressive strategy on racial social engineering. The bill expands the scope of ministerial powers to the current BEE regime, which has a number of important changes. It's going to affect, the IRR calculates, approximately 85% of the formal private sector workforce. It will compel employers to apply vague criteria in an opaque process in overturning the supposed voluntary racial self-classifications of their employees. In other words, it will essentially force employers to do a kind of pencil test without telling them how, or face fines so severe that they could be bankrupted. This is contrary, the IRR says, to the rule of law. It, of course, doubles down on a policy that has failed to uplift and improve the lives of the majority of Black South Africans, and instead created a politically connected super elite who are able to exploit the system while failing millions of people who languish in poverty. It puts, I believe, certain sector targets. The minister can basically micromanage the hiring employees, the hiring choices of firms. Essentially, what it's going to do is take, I'm sure many of you listening will remember the Dis-Chem memo, a moratorium on hiring whites. That kind of policy would now become within the government's power to enforce at large, and any company that failed to meet the minister's racial quotas will be banned completely from doing any business with the government. Now, we've gone on at length on this show, and also we've seen in recent years the incredible failures of our racial laws in actually improving the country. And in fact, in many cases, they do the opposite. They make things much worse. Notably, of course, the Zondo Commission pointed out that BEE was used as essentially a cover to commit an enormous amount of corruption and undermining of public services during state capture. And that, according to the Zondo Commission, this violates the Constitution because there's a requirement that the state get the best value for money. And this should supersede the desire to racially stratify and build society in some image. Of course, so BEE is bad in the fact that it causes a lot of damage, it hurts race relations, but it's also bad because it doesn't even achieve what it sets out to achieve, which is the upliftment of the majority of Black South Africans. So, Chris, let me start with you. What do you make of the president signing this into law? What will the consequences for our economy be? What can we expect going forward?
Yeah, just pragmatically from the regulatory bureaucratic point of view, placing this sort of power in a singular minister's hands, and don't just focus on the current minister, but any future minister, whatever the composition of a future government might be, presuming that an individual and those around him in the corridors of bureaucratic power have the knowledge to arbitrarily decide sort of sector targets, as it were, already opens up massive avenues of abuse and just increases the trend of centralization of state power that we've seen. up until this point. So you're going to continue seeing things like a very high unemployment rate, because why would you take on this risk of starting a small business, or any business larger than 50 employees, because you'll undertake this risk premium that the minister in the future is going to decide you who operate in Tembisa, your hairdresser, does not fit whatever racial quota makeup he or she decides is correct. I mean, it's it's astounding in its sort of arrogance, and also astounding in terms of its disgust. I think to think that you can centrally manage society in this particular way, that the only way you're going to get quote unquote transformation and inclusive growth is by giving bureaucrats more power, who have proven to have not delivered on what the policies, were actually supposed to, in theory, at least. I also just want to add, you're going to see this could accelerate on the positive side, many businesses and citizens just exiting from the state, as it were, so not wanting to deal with this kind of thing. So maybe they'll just try and downsize their businesses, which on the unfortunate side means even more jobs being shared, but also just not engaging with these government processes. Sort of another step in delegitimizing the apparatus of the state, as it were. This huge desire for centralized control and minutia of management of society and the economy could mean, just more legitimacy lost on the side of the state, which we've already seen amplified in the last 2 weeks with things like the exemption for Eskom rolled back immediately, this escape of Thabo Bester, all this sort of stuff just piling on, that the state really doesn't have any particular capacity to run things well, and how things are being undermined, how that narrative and that idea of, the state needs to control things is steadily being undermined. On the risk side, the economic risk side, it's massive in terms of high unemployment, more incentives for people not to undertake that risk of being an entrepreneur, of investing in the country, of trying to create jobs that the country desperately needs. You, over the long run, send this signal again to the world. At the time when we're having yet another investment conference where Ramaphosa talks about billions and trillions being invested, you send the signal to the world where international investors don't come and take the risk on South Africa. Go elsewhere where things are more clear, where things are better thought out, both morally and pragmatically. Just don't opt for South Africa.
It's difficult to kind of summarize all in one go the incredibly rich number of ways in which this bill is a disaster for race relations, for economic activity, for investment, for poverty alleviation. Sherry, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I think the government's doubling down on BEE and transformation policies. It just once again shows that they are anti-poor. I mean, a very young Black South African living in Alexandra or Tembisa is not going to benefit necessarily from these types of policies. It's just the crony elite and the politically connected in Johannesburg and urban centers that are going to benefit massively. And of course, these policies have been used over and over again for corruption purposes. And it's just, people are, when they have the means to do so, they try to move away from the state. They move to the private sector to get basic services. And for the state to now try and to strengthen its grip on even the private sector, it just creates an environment where of social engineering, and where the whole idea of non-racialism in South Africa doesn't exist under the current ANC government. They are trying to racialize every aspect of society. And as you say, that actually benefits, it actually is at the detriment to mainly Black South Africans, poor Black South Africans. We've seen in the last few years that inequality, intra-racial inequality, has been increasing rapidly. The gap between Black elites and the Black poor majority is just widening, because the government is just determined to chase these anti-poor policies that only benefit themselves and their friends or their members. What we actually need in this country is policies that will uplift those at grassroots levels. Make sure that young Black South Africans in township areas have access to quality education. Remove any sort of hindrance for small businesses and entrepreneurs, so that we can see people create jobs for themselves. But that's not the focus of the ANC at the moment. And as you and both Chris have articulated, this is just going to lead to an even greater rate of inequality and unemployment.
Of course, beyond the racial aspects of this, and you kind of touched on this a bit, Chris, the granting of it a lot of discretionary power, as they're called, to a minister, to sort of set regulations and to micromanage businesses, opens up an enormous opportunity for abuse of power, for corruption, for mismanagement that we've seen play out time and time again in ANC policymaking, where regardless of what exactly the law is trying to do, it grants the minister some enormous power, and very quickly we see abuse, corruption, mismanagement follow. What's your final thoughts on this before we move on?
Yeah, you've seen already how bigger businesses and those sort of with crony influence, they don't need more regulations to get those government contracts. Bosasa jumps to mind, Digital Vibes as the easiest examples. So that's likely.
What Dis-Chem was trying to do last year was kind of get ahead of this piece of legislation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the idea of perverse incentives. So bigger businesses who can deal with the compliance costs and the regulatory costs, they can continue getting government business, and they'll tell you that things are working fine. They're fine in their Santon offices. They've got, higher than inflation salary increases. The country's doing well. But for the majority of South Africans on the ground, it's going to continue being very, very difficult. We will see this challenged by various organizations and institutions. So I hope, of course, that succeeds. But in a way, maybe one could be glad for this kind of thing, because it serves to further expose the disconnect between what the current government tells us is important versus what, in our polling, the majority of South Africans feel is important, which is things like high unemployment, load shedding, not things like BE, expropriation without compensation. So it could be useful to accelerate that disconnect between what those in power think we want versus what South Africans actually want.
And the Institute of Race Relations, I believe, is planning to challenge this in court in the near future because of its obvious, what we believe is unconstitutional nature. All right, let's move on to our next story. And this is a survey from the Social Research Foundation, which has found that it doesn't really matter how you slice up South Africa's population. Everyone pretty much agrees the country is going in the wrong direction. Most South Africans, regardless of race, income level, or political affiliation, say the country is moving in the wrong direction. The thing looked into, it's surveyed 1,500 people who the survey say is demographically and geographically representative of registered voters, and has a margin of error of 4. It found that 88% of white South Africans believe that SA is headed in the wrong direction, followed by 81% of Indians, Coloureds at 77%, and Black South Africans at 65%. Only 7% of people from any race believe that the country is actually moving in the right direction. And then when you actually break this down by political party, unsurprisingly, DA supporters are 83% of them say the country's moving in the wrong direction. 82% of the EFF do as well. But interestingly, 54% of ANC voters believe that the country is moving in the wrong direction. Gerbrandt, what do you make of this?
Yeah, I think there were questions about the methodology of the survey, but I think the methodology is there's no question about it, because if you have a country where unemployment is skyrocketing to the point where the majority of South Africans are now going to have no work, I think it's very clear that many South Africans don't trust the government in improving the country, and nobody will agree that the country is going in the right direction. And that's the big problem with that is if the majority of people think that the country is moving in the wrong direction, they're not going to want to stay in South Africa. And there was this narrative that only the middle class or the skilled are leaving the country, but recent research has also shown that even those at the lower income levels are also leaving the country. And President Ramaphosa spoke about, improving the visa system to attract more skilled foreign workers to South Africa. But how are you going to do that when South Africans aren't even confident about, when the majority of South Africans aren't even confident about how things are going in the country? And I think with rocketing unemployment, inequality, and crime getting out of control, crime is really raging at the moment, and the government has absolutely no control over it. There's just simply no way for South Africans to want to keep residing here, to keep investing here, and believe that this is a place where they can raise families.
Chris, what's your take on this? I mean, this does suggest that when even a majority of ANC voters are saying that they don't think the country's going in the right direction, that political change is definitely becoming more possible.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, but with the caveat of voter abstention, which we've seen a trend of increasing abstention over the last few election cycles. So depending on how that shakes out, those who are disillusioned with the ANC, and if they do go vote next year, yes, of course, then you will see change. There are just South Africans, I think, who feel the political system as a whole is not working for them, and they're leaving that sort of by the wayside as they try and navigate daily life. I think it's consistent, this latest research with that from other institutions, including the Center for Risk Analysis, in that over time, and it's important not to look at data points just on a particular day, but sort of trend lines. So you're seeing this general disillusionment with the ANC. Maybe it's a bit of a lag effect, but over time, people are seeing that it's not materially delivering in terms of their quality of life. We, for example, in a survey last year asked, has the quality of your life improved over the last 5 years? And I think about 2/3 said the quality of life had worsened over the last 5 years, and their future prospects, they also don't foresee, I think just over half, that it won't improve over the next 5 years. So you look at your life and how things are going and where can you make some sort of change. And that is in one way through going and voting for a different party. Now, it's another question if opposition parties have made enough and good enough of a value sell to actually convince voters, ANC voters, to go and vote for them. One analogy is that many supporters of the ANC grew up with the ANC as sort of this emotional home. Now the opposition parties have built a nice shiny hotel across the road. The roof doesn't leak. When you turn on a switch, the light turns on, electricity is available, but it's still not your home. It's not your emotional place that you grew up with. And what does it take then to shift voters to make that move? We're going to see whether those opposition parties have done enough. I fear maybe not, depending sort of based on how coalition agreements have broken down in various different ways. Have they really made a convincing enough case? We will see next year. But overall, I think, and if the ANC doesn't realize it yet, they probably won't be the majority next year.
No, more signs that things may be changing. Speaking of our fractious politics and opposition parties and all of that, let's move on to our next story. And this is about some comments made recently by the leader of the Patriotic Alliance, Gayton Mackenzie, who has stated that now His goal is to become, I think he said by the end of the week, the mayor of Johannesburg. This comes after, it's kind of difficult to say where this exactly started, except that a breakdown of relations between the ANC, EFF, and Patriotic Alliance in both Ekurhuleni and Johannesburg. The focus is on the current mayor of Johannesburg, who is from the El Jamaha party, but he's backed by the ANC and the EFF, as well as the Patriotic Alliance, at least until now. Tapelo Ahmad, he has had a lot of bad interviews, but he said in a recent one that the city was about to take some sort of 9 billion rand loan, which even the ANC kind of said, wait, what? Because he doesn't.
Yeah, they were like, don't tell people about
it. So Gayton Mackenzie has said that it was a mistake to support Tapelo Ahmad for mayorship of Johannesburg, and in fact, he's looking at getting himself appointed into that position. He says that he will do for Joburg what he did for the Central Karoo District Municipality, which is where he was recently where he's currently the mayor. He says that so this follows after Action SA and the Freedom Front Plus, I believe, tabled or at least was Action SA tabled a motion of no confidence in Mayor Ahmad. And this will, of course, create a vacancy in the Johannesburg mayorship. Gayton says that he's discussed with the Freedom Front Plus and Herman Mashaba and the DA to be put forward as a potential mayoral candidate in Johannesburg. However, when he said this, Herman Mashaba from Action SA said that there was no deal, but that they had talked to the Patriotic Alliance about throwing out Mayor Ahmad. He also claims that he had a braai with John Steenhuisen and Corne Mulder, but he doesn't really say what they agreed to there, except that it looks as though I think this is quite unlikely, because I do not see, for example, the DA supporting a mayoral candidate, particularly from a party that they've had a very difficult relationship with, because, of course, the Patriotic Alliance was actually in coalition but a few months ago with the DA and Action SA in Johannesburg until it switched sides. So a bit of a mess all round. Chris, let's start with you again. What do you think of Gayton's chances of becoming mayor of Johannesburg?
I'm not going to discount anything. I don't think we should too easily dismiss anything radically changing in coalition politics at the moment, just given how new it is and how new it is in the South African democratic story. Some countries, maybe like Germany, Israel, others have had much longer for this sort of thing to mature and become a little bit more predictable than we have. So I'm not ruling it out completely. I think it's improbable, but not impossible. And Gayton, to his credit, seems to be able to sort of dominate a narrative and push things to maybe where he wants it. You can have your foibles with his policy choices, ideology, but he's seems definitely to have one of the more character,
charismatic and competent media personalities in politics at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely, and that carries a lot of weight. I mean, you see the sort of deficit side for the DA, for example, on this thing with these lack of charismatic leaders, maybe where they can point to the hard evidence of good service delivery, but it doesn't translate necessarily into buy-in to the message and to people supporting them. So I think Gayton maybe has that going for him. For those in Johannesburg, including myself, the roller coaster of coalition governance continues, the sort of petri dish of testing these things in the South African context. So we're in for, I think, more uncertainty and sort of instability, as it were, projects being shelved, infrastructure maintenance not being done because there's so much churn and all this interest and stuff. And there's another useful case study to look at, where will the ANC and FF really work together, as some have said they're looking at a coalition for 2024. Is this actually going to shake up? How could it happen now in terms of putting forward Gayton as mayor, supporting him or not?
So it looks at the moment like, to me, that this could all just be a negotiating tactic by Mackenzie to get more out of the ANC. He said, I believe in the same interview, that the ANC yesterday got an offer to get another MMC position in Johannesburg, that of housing. But that he said that he didn't really trust them because only 50% of promises with the ANC have been kept, according to him. He said, quote, "We saw arrogance. Our calls were not being picked up in Gauteng. These are the same people who used to call us every day. Our complaints are not being heard. The ANC has taken us for granted in Ekurhuleni." Gerbrandt, what do you make of all this?
Yeah, it might be Gayton's way to kind of, exert some influence over the ANC as well. I know the ANC is trying to, retain mayorship in Mangaung, and the ANC said that they will need the help of the Super 7, which includes Patriotic Alliance, to assist them with that. And Gayton knows that the ANC needs him, so he's probably trying to, demonstrate that, he'll help the ANC if the ANC is willing to help them in Johannesburg. As for, will Johannesburg benefit from a Gayton mayorship? I think that firstly depends on like what happened at the Central Karoo District Municipality. How has he performed there? Which I've looked up a little bit there, and it seems like he has done some positive, or he has taken some positive steps there. But the problem is, and that's what Chris has touched on, is that even if you have a good track record in service delivery, that might not be enough to win votes at the election if you don't have enough charismatic personality, and also the instability of coalitions in general is I think the political parties in the country, we're still getting used to collaborating and working together with each other, seeing how far we can compromise and push each other. So this instability is just going to continue for the next few years, and that's going to come at the expense of service delivery, no matter who is really at the helm of the mayorship. So yeah, I think it's just this, like Chris said, it's a roller coaster, especially for Johannesburg.
All right, let's move on to our last story for today. And this is comments made by President Ramaphosa. This is just the sort of madness of our politics right now. At an investment conference, where he's attempting to attract what he says is his target of 2 trillion rand new investment in the country. He was at the 5th South Africa Investment Conference at Sandton this morning, and he talked about how government was working on streamlining visa applications to attract skilled people to work in various South African companies. They talked about introducing a trusted employer scheme where certain companies would get employees they wanted to recruit from overseas fast-tracked through the visa process, and that government would create a points-based system with flexible pathways for skilled applicants in line with global best practice. Gerbrandt, your thoughts?
I'll just briefly say that you can overhaul as much as you can regarding the visa system, but if you can't fix the general environment in South Africa in terms of career prospects, economic growth, investment, education, all that, South Africa is going to be a hard sell abroad. And I think, if I remember correctly, there was a survey that put Johannesburg, the city of Johannesburg, dead last out of 52 cities featured for expats to settle in. And that's because people don't feel like there's enough opportunities for career growth. It's not a safe environment. Unless the government fixes those basic things, it's going to be hard to attract skilled foreigners.
Chris, your final thoughts before we close up?
No, I don't think too much of maybe deep analysis to add to what Gerrie has said. Just again, you ramp up the difficulty of operating. So you sort of ratchet up the issues of why come here versus when you can go somewhere else and the process is smoother, and don't be surprised at the consequences of that. Even to our immediate north, sub-Saharan Africa, the huge potential for growth and investment, it could very well happen there, as we're seeing with our ports at the moment, where companies are using Mozambique and Namibia. We could see similar trends in other parts of the economy.
No, definitely. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. We hope that you enjoyed the show. We will be back next week with the Daily Friend Show. And yeah, everyone have a wonderful weekend. Cheers.